India beats a global record for 3,14,000 cases, deaths over 2,000. It's the second highest in the world. And finally, the Prime Minister has cancelled his Bengal campaign to chair COVID meetings tomorrow. And India is in the middle of an oxygen emergency. Prime Minister forced to get into a high-level meeting. SOS calls, meanwhile, continue to come to NDTV from hospitals, saying they're left with barely any hours of oxygen supply.
If we cannot give them oxygen even, what is the situation? When patient comes to a patient will die. Patient will die.
And some relief is on its way. In a first oxygen-loaded roll-on, roll-off, the Ro-Ro Oxygen Express service of the Indian Railways has now left Maharashtra from RINL, will reach Visakhapatnam by evening. Supreme Court now steps in to take up the oxygen emergency in India, indicates that High Court cases be transferred to Supreme Court and a centralized system look into the crisis. Meanwhile, after the EC order, now Mamata Banerjee also cancelled her rallies. And we also bring you the pandemic heroes, people who are doing their bit to contribute in these trying times. Hello and welcome. You're watching NDTV 24/7. I'm Sonal Mehrotra Kapoor. Let's begin with the numbers. Over 3,14,000 cases in one single day. Now that's India setting an extremely grim global record. And guess what? India has taken just 17 days from 1 lakh a day to 3 lakh plus a day. Just 17 days. Contrasted with how much time the same statistic took in USA, well, they took 62 days. And India, in middle of the second wave, is reaching that number much, much faster. But India's cases today are higher than America's highest number of daily cases as well. In just 44 days, India's 7-day average daily deaths have gone from less than 100 to over 1,600 today. And there's no sign of any turnaround just yet. Today, the record was over 2,100 cases. In fact, deaths over there. And on the 9th of March, there were just about 77 COVID deaths reported in the country. That just goes on to tell you how quickly things have changed in the national capital. Our response needs to be as quick, but something that's extremely missing in the country right now. Look at the oxygen crisis to begin with. Struggling for breath, even MLAs of the national capital. Saurabh Bharadwaj from a hospital bed pleading the centre and Haryana government to help Delhi with oxygen. This on a day when NDTV continued to get SOS calls from several hospitals in the national capital saying they're left with 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours of oxygen supply. Doctors breaking down saying, what will we do when oxygen is out?
Struggling to breathe, Saurabh Bharadwaj, MLA from Delhi, is pleading central and Haryana government to help Delhi with oxygen supplies, as Delhi faces acute shortage of oxygen, with many hospitals with just hours of oxygen left.
मैं इस हॉस्पिटल में हूँ, यहाँ की ऑक्सीजन भी 3 घंटे की बची है. मैं सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट और हरियाणा गवर्नमेंट को ये रिक्वेस्ट करता हूँ कि इस तरीके की चीज़ें ना करें. बहुत सारे लोग इस ऑक्सीजन पे डिपेंडेंट हैं.
51-year-old Ashish Goyal pleads with folded hands for oxygen supply for his hospitalized father, who is on ventilator at Delhi's Saroj Super Speciality Hospital After hospital authorities informed Mr. Goel that only 15 minutes of oxygen is left at the hospital.
हर अब 15 मिनट की बैकअप आ रहा है कि 15 मिनट में ही ऑक्सीजन खत्म होने वाली है। पूरे लोग सब ऑक्सीजन के लिए बहुत परेशान हैं। हॉस्पिटल भी बहुत कोशिश कर रहा है कि किसी तरीके से ऑक्सीजन आए, और अदरवाइज अगर ऑक्सीजन नहीं मिलती है तो बहुत यहाँ पे पेशेंट्स की जान को खतरा होने वाला है।
In a major respite to over 150 COVID patients, Sarod Super Speciality Hospital received a tanker of medical oxygen. However, the situation remains critical in several other hospitals. In a private hospital in Ghaziabad, ambulances instead of transporting patients are now transporting oxygen cylinders to be refilled. The situation in Vaishali's Lakshmi Chandra Hospital is extremely critical, with 118 COVID patients and nearly an hour of oxygen left.
कोई ऑक्सीजन सप्लाई नहीं है,
नहीं फिलहाल में तो नेगेटिव मुझरात की रिपोर्ट आई है।
कुछ भी है, मैं अस्पताल में किसी मरीज को भर्ती करने की पोजीशन पे नहीं हूँ, ऑक्सीजन आ नहीं रही है।
Upset with the present scenario, MD Mukesh Goel has written a letter to the administration appealing them to take over the hospital.
ऐसी कंडीशन के अंदर हमने शासन से भी कहा, शासन कोशिश कर रहा है लेकिन कोई सफलता मिल नहीं रही है। तो आखिर में मजबूरन होकर हमने कहा कि शासन हमारा हॉस्पिटल टेक ओवर कर ले, जिस तरह से चाहे हमारा पूरा स्टाफ उसको कोऑपरेट करेगा, कम से कम हम अपना जो टाइम है वो मरीजों के इलाज के लिए लगा सकते हैं।
Shanti Mukund Hospital, another hospital in East Delhi, has started discharging patients who are not on oxygen support due to the lack of oxygen. The hospital alleges that the firm responsible for providing oxygen has stopped responding to our calls.
हमारे पास 110 पेशेंट एडमिटेड है, इसमें से अराउंड 12 वेंटिलेटर पे हैं और 85 मोर देन 5 लीटर ऑक्सीजन है, और सारे के सारे सिक पेशेंट्स हैं, और जो हमारे कुछ पेशेंट जो डिस्चार्ज हो सकते हैं उनको डिस्चार्ज करने को बोल दिया।
Meanwhile, the Delhi High Court gave stringent direction to the central government for smooth supply of oxygen to the hospitals, a special corridor for oxygen transportation, adequate security for the tankers. If anyone stops, obstructs the movement of oxygen, criminal action will be taken against them. Earlier, the central government had claimed that to meet the exponential rise in demand, it has increased quota of oxygen for 7 states.
The COVID-19 situation in the country has deteriorated so much right now that despite the efforts from the central as well as the state government, several hospitals, especially in Delhi NCR, are reporting shortage in oxygen for COVID-19 patients that are admitted in these hospitals. And the lives of hundreds of COVID patients are dependent on these kind of oxygen cylinders, and these cylinders are somehow managing to keep them alive. With camera person Sushil Rathi and correspondent Saurav Shukla and Ravi Ranjan Shukla, I'm Akshay Dongde for NDTV.
And doctors after doctor in hospitals, experienced doctors are now coming out to say, well, we've never seen a situation like this. Several of them now breaking down, saying, what do we do? Give us oxygen. We can't see patients dying in front of our eyes.
We probably, you see, we as a doctor, we as a hospital, we are supposed to give life. If we cannot give them oxygen even, what is the situation? When patient comes to, patient will die. Patient will die. We know they are trying to help, but there is no oxygen, sir. There is no oxygen. We know this. We know, everybody knows this. Even government is trying to help us. But ultimately, oxygen is to be generated and supplied.
And in the national capital, just one of the many places in the country where beds are running out, another problem now emerging, that people are not being admitted if they don't have a COVID positive. Now, while there is a clear directive on this that you have to take in patients with symptoms, prioritize that over the test, with absolute lack of any sort of beds, now hospitals being forced to ask them to leave.
बैड नहीं है वो नीचे लिटा के इलाज करा लूंगा। चल हॉस्पिटल धक्के खा के उसको मरने का कैसे छोड़ दूं मैं? गेट छाटो अब न्यूज़ मत मारिए, इसको एडमिट करा दीजिए सर प्लीज।
43-year-old Aslam Khan brought his severely ill 30-year-old wife Ruby and their young daughter on his bike to one of Delhi's biggest government hospitals, the Lok Naik Jayaprakash Hospital. They've been turned back from 3 hospitals because despite a very worrying chest scan which shows a COVID infection, she doesn't have a COVID positive lab report.
नेगेटिव दिया है, लेकिन इसको पॉजिटिव बता के फिर भी कर रहे हैं कोरोना है, लेकिन नहीं मान रहे हैं। लंग्स में इंफेक्शन हो गया है, अभी कर रहा है ट्रॉमा सेंटर वालों ने, नहीं ले रहे हैं अंदर। पंत वालों ने यहाँ भेज दिया, अब ये कहीं और भेज रहे हैं, ये तो रास्ते में मर जाएगी।
Khan finally managed to get into LNJP, but there are many other patients struggling. As with the new variant, though lab test reports are negative, other reports like blood tests and chest x-rays or CT scans indicate COVID. Often they are gasping for breath but can't get admission in a COVID ward with no COVID positive report.
मम्मी है, संतोष देवी है। मैं 2 दिन से घूम रहा हूँ। दीनदयाल में गया था तो उन्होंने नेगेटिव रहे, लेकिन फिर भी कोई इलाज नहीं करा। मेरी मम्मी को वही प्रॉब्लम थी, सांस की प्रॉब्लम हो रही थी, फिर भी कुछ नहीं करा उन्होंने। बाकी कहीं पे भी नहीं करा था। 3 दिन से मैं घूमे जा रहा था, दीनदयाल वालों ने भी किसी ने कुछ नहीं करा। और नेगेटिव रिपोर्ट आई थी, कोई दिक्कत नहीं थी, लेकिन सांस की प्रॉब्लम आ रही थी उनको, फिर भी कोई इलाज नहीं करा उन्होंने। अब मैं यहाँ पे 2-2.5 घंटे खड़ा होने के बाद उन्होंने अंदर ले लिया है।
Rahul Verma, who runs Uday Foundation, an NGO which works with families of patients, lost his 71-year-old uncle just a few days ago, as hospital after hospital refused him admission after an initial COVID negative report.
Again, I got his COVID test done. Then I came to know that, he came COVID positive. Then again, we rushed him to the hospital. He sat outside of that hospital for 6-7 hours without any oxygen or anything. In the next 48 hours away, we just lost him to the COVID.
According to the rules, patients with such severe symptoms should not be denied admission regardless of their test result. During the last wave, hospitals even had separate observation wards for COVID suspects, but with all beds running full this time, hospitals are more stringent. And today, at testing labs across Delhi, there are long queues. 76-year-old Anil Madan and his 71-year-old wife Nidhi managed to get a test done in their 4th attempt.
I had to go to 3 places, to the Mahajan imaging and the Lifelong were closed. Then I tried the Dang laboratory online checking in, but I couldn't do it. And then I came here because I came to know that here it is drive-in test is being done. We are hearing all kinds of reports. There are few people that first-hand knowledge that they have passed away because they couldn't get the beds.
Both central and state governments are saying that they are ramping up hospital beds, but on ground families are struggling to get their patients admitted, and every minute lost over a COVID certificate is precious for such families. In New Delhi with camera person AJ Joseph, this is Sukirti Dwivedi for NDTV.
That's the reality of the country now. What's also the reality is that rallies continue to happen in West Bengal because, of course, elections had to take place and people had to win them. But then came in this evening a letter from the Election Commission. We'll get to that in a bit. But now in news just coming in at this hour that Mamata Banerjee has announced that in wake of upsurge in COVID-19 cases across the country, the ECI order that she's citing, I'm cancelling all my pre-scheduled meetings and will reach out to the people only virtually now. Well, this order comes in light of EC now, the Election Commission finally waking up to the situation and saying that no public rallies, foot marches or road shows can be held in Bengal for the last 2 rounds of assembly elections, and the Election Commission adding that hours after it was ordered to take action in view of the rising COVID cases by the Calcutta High Court. All previous orders, it went on to say, for rallies and road shows stand cancelled and only meetings and all are attended at this point with not more than 500 people will be allowed. Bengal, remember, in middle of all this, has crossed 10,000 mark daily for the first time 2 days ago and had about 11,948 cases over the past 24 hours, 56 lives lost. That at least is the government figure at this point. But also tomorrow 9 a.m. is going to be Prime Minister's review meeting relating to the COVID situation in the country. Prime Minister also, remember earlier, had cancelled his rallies in Bengal. That came just minutes before the EC order actually was made public. And at 10 a.m. he will interact with the chief ministers of at least 10 states regarding the COVID situation. At 12:30 then he will hold a meeting regarding the oxygen crisis in the country. An oxygen crisis indeed it is. Oxygen emergency, as many are calling it. Supreme Court today took up the case in its own hands, saying that 6 high courts are doing their best, but some confusion may withdraw some issues that have been laid out by the High Court, and it basically told the centre that they want national plan for oxygen supply, essential drugs, vaccination and power to declare a lockdown as well. The bench also, comprising of Justices Nageshwar Rao and Ravindra Bhatt, issued notice to the central government on these issues and appointed senior advocate Hari Shalve as the amicus curiae. The High Courts had passed certain orders which had talked about imposing lockdown, for example, in 5 cities in UP. Meanwhile, the centre has issued a notice as well. Delhi gets the supply for about 480 tons a day of oxygen supply. The special corridor with adequate security of oxygen tankers has been talked about as well, and criminal action against those who obstruct oxygen tankers. And High Court directed the centre to look into the feasibility of transportation of oxygen from Durgapur in the Kalinga units as well through the Oxygen Express. On shortage of medicines and wastage of COVID vaccines, centre had sought time to make submissions, but centre asked to inform the court on how many beds are being added to the COVID patients in the central government hospitals. Also, several other high courts now giving out their intervening now in middle of this emergency. This is what the Bombay High Court said. It pulled up the centre again, saying that why can't you start with door-to-door vaccination? There needs to be a solution. You can't leave old people like this. It's like choosing between devil and the deep blue sea. You have ICUs in ambulances, can manage fridge, can't leave the old to die. Just like that. Lots of orders coming in, but we still wait to see what will be action on the ground. With that, a quick break. Back with all the latest.